So today we want to talk about trees and shrubs. They're essentially the same thing, but we'll talk a little bit about some differences. So what is a tree? I think it's important that people learn to understand how they actually grow, and we'll compare them to perennials so that we see what the differences are. Then we'll talk about some things like planting a tree, which, believe it or not, is a real mystery to almost everybody. Although it shouldn't be. And then at the end, we're going to do a little mini course on pruning, which is what I think troubles most gardeners. So what is a tree? Well, here's an example of a little tree. We've got a single trunk there, branches coming up, flower buds on there. That looks like a nice little tree. Well, here we have this thing here, and it's a shrub. So what's the difference between these two? Well, it turns out those are exactly the same species of plant. It's a viburnum, and these are extremely fragrant, a great plant. And you can take this plant, and if you prune it to a single stem, you have a tree. If you prune it to multiple stems, you have a shrub. And most people will grow this one as a shrub, but as you see in the previous picture, it can also be done as a tree. The difference between these two is kind of subtle and is not really well defined. There's the plant itself with a close-up flower. Flowers are quite large and really nice, and you can smell this thing from 10 feet away without any problem. So let's compare trees and shrubs. Well, one is size, so if it gets really big, we tend to call it a tree. If it's smaller, we call it a shrub. If it has one trunk, it's a tree. If it's more than one, it's usually a shrub. But of course, you've probably seen birch trees with multiple trunks. If I cut it to the ground, trees may regrow, maybe not. Most shrubs will regrow. So these definitions are very loose. We tend to use those two terms kind of interchangeably. From a botanical point of view, a biochemistry point of view, there's really very little difference between these two. The difference between shrub and subshrub is even smaller. So if it stays under 2 feet, we'll call it a subshrub. And things like lavender and Russian sage are examples of subshrubs. If it's taller than that, then we call it a shrub. But really, these are all pretty much the same. Now, here's some other subshrubs that you may be familiar with. Sages, you probably know. The wormwood, the artemisias are quite common in gardens. Iberis is a low-growing alpine plant. The thymes, they're mostly subshrubs. And the reason I always point this out is that most of these things, in fact, all of these things, are in the perennial section of nurseries, and they're in perennial books. And everyone calls them perennials, and they're not. They're shrubs, and we need to treat them more like shrubs. And if we do that, then we're less likely to kill them. Big advice I can give you for all of these things is be very careful about cutting them back. Perennials go underground, and we can cut them to the ground. You won't harm them. These things, some of them, if you cut them too low, you'll kill them. And I think that's why people have a lot of trouble growing that English lavender. And the other reason is people don't buy the right kind of lavender. So there's 3 or 4 different kinds of lavender, and the one that looks really great is the French lavender, and that's just not hardy in zone 5. So if you bought that one and it died, then it's hardiness issues. But if you buy English lavender, which is perfectly hardy here, and it dies, you probably pruned it incorrectly. How do these trees grow? Here's a little picture of some trees. One of the neat things about trees is that some of them we can prune into all kinds of weird shapes. They grow just fine. This is a cross section of a trunk. And here are the 3 main things that most people know about. So the center part we call the hardwood. Then comes the softwood, and then the outer layer is the bark. But have you ever wondered why these trunks get bigger and bigger over years? Like, how do they get thicker and thicker? That's an interesting question. But before I give you the answer to that, here's another interesting thing that many people don't realize is that as a tree gets taller, the specific point on the trunk doesn't actually move up. So if I take a tree that's, let's say, 10 feet tall, and I put a nail in at 6 feet height, and now I wait, and that tree gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that nail will always be at 6 feet height. Even though the tree's getting taller, that point on the trunk does not grow up. A tree only grows out and it makes new branches. So it gets taller by making new branches and it gets thicker by growing out. And by the way, never put a nail in a tree because someone's going to come along with a chainsaw and swear at you. So if we have a close look at this cross section of a tree, it looks something like this. The inside of that tree, the heartwood, it's pretty much dead cells and nothing is happening there. So that's old cells that have slowly accumulated over time, and the center of that tree is completely dead. Its only real purpose is structure. It holds the tree up, but other than that, it's biologically, it's no longer of much use to the tree. The interesting stuff happens very near the bark area. So if we go from the outside in, we have this bark layer, which we typically recognize. And then we have something called the cambium layer. And this cambium layer is right underneath the bark, and it sort of has two sides to it. One side is the phloem, and the other side is the xylem. The xylem is responsible for moving water and nutrients from the roots up the plant. And so you find this xylem phloem in all parts of the plant, but particularly in the roots and stems and leaves. So the xylem is moving water up the tree, and the phloem moves nutrients that are made in the leaves back down to the roots. Okay, so it's like a two-way highway. One side is going up the tree and the other side is coming down the tree, and the cells in these areas are separated. And what makes this grow is really the cambium layer. The cambium layer has premature phloem and xylem cells and is continually making more of them. So it's the cambium layer that actually is growing. It's constantly making more cells, and one side becomes phloem and the other side becomes xylem. As the tree gets thicker and thicker, that bark gets pushed out and the xylem cells slowly die. The closer they are to the center of the tree, the more dead they are and the more useless they become. They stop moving that water. So that's how trees actually get thicker. And it doesn't matter whether I'm cutting the tip of a bud or the main trunk of a tree or a shrub, they all work the same way. Now, here's a really interesting experiment that was done in the 17th century. So this is a long time ago, long before anybody knew much about chemistry. Somebody wanted to understand where all these nutrients go in a tree. So they took a tree and they planted it in a tub of soil and they weighed everything very carefully. We took a 5-pound tree and put it in 200 pounds of soil. And now what they did was they only put on distilled water. Okay, so this was water with no nutrients. The only place for the tree to get nutrients was from the soil. 5 years later, they weighed these things up, and the tree weighed 169 pounds, and the soil weighed 199 pounds. So in 5 years, the soil lost 1 pound, but the tree gained 164 pounds. Why? Well, I can see all your hands raising up because you all have the answer. So good thing we're not in person or someone would have to tell me the answer. When the trees are growing, they're absorbing CO2 from the air, right? That thing that's causing us all this grief with pollution and climate change. The CO2 is carbon and oxygen, and it absorbs that and turns it into sugars, and that's plant food. Eventually, it turns it into wood, and wood is basically carbon and oxygen, a lot of carbon. The tree took all the weight out of the air. There's very little nutrients that are actually taken out of the soil to make this thing grow. I guess there's two sort of takeaways here that I find fascinating. One is that all of this tree, and in fact, this is true of any plant really, but it's even more important in trees. All that wood is the carbon from the air. And that's why we say, well, if we keep the forests and we keep the trees, we'll have less CO2 in the air. The other thing that is really surprising to me is that all the nutrients, all the nitrogen and phosphate and potassium and magnesium and all those things we talk about all the time when we are fertilizing plants adds almost nothing to the weight of the plant. And that's a good thing, really, because what it means is that the soil doesn't run out of these minerals very quickly, which is, again, goes against what our mental opinion of this is. Anyways, if we have a closer look at this is photosynthesis, and it's critical for all plants. So CO2 from the air, sunlight goes into the leaves, nutrients and water go from the roots up to the leaves, and then photosynthesis takes place. In very rough terms, photosynthesis is the process where we take CO2 from the air and make sugars. And in that process, the tree gives off oxygen. It's a good thing because that's the oxygen we breathe. So before plants were on Earth, and in fact, when we're talking about plants, we're talking about really microbes. Long before the trees and shrubs, it was the photosynthesizing microbes that produced enough oxygen for us to live on Earth. So this is a pretty important process for us. So now the plant has these sugars in the leaves. And by the way, sugars is mostly a form of carbon and oxygen. It sends those back down to the roots, and it keeps a lot in the leaves. Uses the sugars to grow and make the wood and make the leaves and do everything that plants do. Let's change the subject a little bit. We're going to have a look at the tip of one of these trees now. And if we look at these tips, in fact, right now is a good time to go out in the garden and look at these because they're swelling and they're starting to show the growth on them. Right at the tip, we have something called the apical bud or the terminal bud. And then down below it, we have other buds. And these are the axillary or the lateral buds. And all of these buds have been in hibernation over winter. And now that it's getting warmer, they're starting to grow. And they all want to grow. But there's something very unique that happens here, and that is that the apical bud wants to take over. So I describe this a little differently. These terms are a little scientific. Let's word it this way. The very top bud, that's the king bud. Okay, the king bud wants to control all the other buds. He wants to keep them from growing. The king bud actually creates a hormone and sends it down the stem. And that hormone prevents the other buds from growing or from growing as fast as they could. The reason for this is that it's good for the tree, really, is that it wants to grow taller. It needs to compete with all the other trees in the forest, and the faster it can grow up, the better it is because it gets more light up there. So it doesn't really want all these side buds from growing. It's better if the top one grows. And that's how it happens. There's the king bud, and then there's all the subject buds down here. And they're all competing to grow, but the plant doesn't make enough food for them all, so the king gets most of it. Now, this will become really important when we talk about pruning. So here's another view of this branch, and you can see a couple of side branches. These side branches were made last summer, or maybe even the year before. They've started growing up, and then we have the center stem going straight up. And if we look at this, we actually have several king buds here. We have 4 branches, and at the tip of every branch is a king bud that wants to try to grow. So the one in the center really is the one that should grow. It's the best for the shrub, but some of these side branches are starting to grow. And you can see the one off to the right here, almost as tall as the center one. And in fact, if you look at the thickness of the stem, the one to the right here is the thickest one. It's actually growing better than that central one. But now there's a conflict. We've got several kings, and they're trying to compete with each other, and they're competing for all the sugar that they can get. And they're both going to try to grow. This can cause us a problem. If this were a tree seedling now, instead of a single trunk, we suddenly have 4 trunks. That is a problem. So we'll talk about this again when we talk about pruning. Let's talk about how this woody material grows throughout the season. So at this time of the year, they're buds. They're just starting to come out. And those buds could be flower buds, or they could be leaf and wood buds, depending on the variety of tree, right? So early flowering things like the forsythia and magnolias, if you go out and look at the buds in a magnolia tree, they're really obvious. Those are all flower buds right now because they're ready to burst and flower. Things that bloom later on in the year, most of what you see on the buds now are growing buds or leaf buds, but both the buds occur. So in the next month or two, these things are all going to start to grow, and they're going to start making new growth, a new stem. They're going to make leaves, but all of that growth is quite soft, and we call that softwood. And in fact, if you go out, say in a month from now, 6 weeks from now, and you take one of these new growths and you bend it, you can bend it almost back on itself. In fact, on some shrubs, the wood is so soft you can actually bend it all the way around and make a knot out of it without it breaking. Now, if you try that with the older growth, from 2 or 3 years ago, all that's hard now. We now have this soft growth, and then the tree stops growing. You won't see any new leaves, you won't see any new buds forming, and it looks like it stopped growing, but in fact, it's doing a lot of growing and it's doing a lot of maturing. It's doing two critical things. One is it's making next year's buds, but the other thing it does, it starts going through this hardening off process. The wood is going from softwood to hardwood. And this takes place from about early to midsummer right into fall. And it does this for a couple reasons. One is to grow big and tall, it needs to get hard. You can imagine if all the trees only had softwood, it'd all be laying on the ground. It wouldn't do much good. And these guys want to get tall so they get to the light. That's one benefit. In this climate, one of the main reasons it makes hardwood is only the hardwood overwinters. Softwood does not. It will get killed off. So this maturation process of going from softwood to hardwood is critical for surviving the winters. Now, in this program, we don't talk a lot about propagation, but this is also important if you're going to take cuttings. Many shrubs can be propagated very easily with cuttings, and if you use softwood cuttings or what they call semi-hardwood, which are sort of in between these two, those are the things that root the easiest. If you try to root hardwood, which will happen, August, September sort of thing, it doesn't root quite so easily. In fact, I used to always do semi-hardwood. So I would collect my wood, say June, July, something like that. And most of it roots pretty easily. I've started collecting softer wood, so earlier in the season, and it actually roots easier on some things. If you've never done this, you really need to give it a try. And Forsythia would be a great choice because it's really easy to root. The other one that's really easy is willows. If you fail on those two, then maybe you shouldn't propagate things. But those are really easy. So go out June, July sort of thing, cut a piece off and go through a rooting process. Don't use water, although both of those I think will root in water. Use some soil, some peat moss and so on and root one of these up. You just be amazed at how this works. Now, not everything can be done this way. So most trees you can't do, like most maples you can't do with cuttings. So let's go out and buy a tree. Like just 2 days ago, someone posted and says, I have this space beside the house and what do you recommend? Now this was going to be more of a shrub than a tree. What do you recommend? Well, there's like 500 choices. How am I supposed to help you with a question like that? And lots of people will answer that and they'll all give the tree or shrub they prefer as opposed to what this person might want. When you're picking these things, you really want to look at them all and figure out what you really want. But there are some things you can think about when you're selecting one of these. Number one is, why do you want to plant a tree? I'm probably going to use the word tree, but tree, shrub, whatever you want there. Why are you planting it? Understand its purpose. Are you trying to hide the neighbors? Do you want some shade over your patio? Are you trying to feed pollinators, for instance, which is becoming much more popular? I grow some hop trees. They're not really native to Guelph, but they are native about an hour's drive from here. And I grow them here because that's the favorite food of the giant swallowtail butterflies. And so they come to my garden and spend their time here and lay their eggs on this shrub. So that's why I planted that one. Other than that, it's not a particularly nice looking shrub, but it is an Ontario native and it's a good food source for them. So understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish. I think that's the most important thing. The next question is, how big do you want it? People pick trees that are going to be way too big for their properties. So you go out and you find yourself a white spruce. And when you buy it, well, it's only 2 feet tall and it's so cute little thing. And you put it in the ground and 20, 30 years later, it takes up the whole backyard. And you go, I shouldn't have bought that. How big do you want this plant? And then look up the mature size of these plants and make sure you're in the right ballpark. There are a lot of plants that are not suitable for our normal size backyard. Again, mostly trees here. Most shrubs are fine, but trees can get very big. They can get very tall. and make sure you're picking something that's right. And here's another problem. A lot of people are trying to hide the neighbors or shed or something, and they go, I want something that grows quick. Well, the problem is there is no such thing as a quick growing tree or shrub that stops at the right height. Okay, if you pick something that's quick growing, it will be big. It's the only way you can get it, unless you're going to do a lot of pruning to keep it in shape. Quick growers are big. The other thing that's perhaps a little less important but is valid to look at is soil type and especially pH. Most trees and shrubs will grow from, say, a pH of 5.5 to 7.5 without any problem. There are a few trees that really do need an acidic soil. One I'm growing is something called a snake bark maple. Which is a very short tree. Its bark has these lines running on it. It's a really cool little tree. It needs an acidic pH. I grow it in my alkaline soil, and I have to put sulfur on it every year just to keep the thing healthy. Okay, that's a really bad thing to buy, but I just wanted to try one and see what it looks like. But for the most part, they're not too fussy about pH. The other group that's really fussy are things like azaleas and rhododendrons. They need acidic soil. Blueberry bushes, which are a shrub, they need acidic soil. Don't even try them around Guelph. They're not going to grow here. And then the third one is a sun and shade thing. Most of these plants prefer lots of sun. So if you have more shade, you got to find something that will grow in shade. Some things will, like this snakebark maple is an understory tree, so it grows below other trees. Here's some other things to consider. What is your growing zone? Make sure it's hardy where you are. Something a lot of people don't think about is the litter that you get off these trees. And it's not so much the leaves usually, it's the fruit that comes off them. Okay, some of them make fruit that the little round nuts with lots of prickly things on them that if you step on them, you'll it's like a thorn in your foot. Some fruit stinks really strongly. Some fruit kind of falls a few every day, and so you're constantly raking up the lawn to clean it up. So how clean is that tree? One tree that was very popular for a while was the silver maple, which is a beautiful tree, but it's constantly losing branches. It's a weak tree. The bark is soft, and so it's constantly breaking off and falling. A tree/shrub that I really like is the redbud. They can be pruned into a small tree, and I've got several of them in the yard. The problem with them is the crotch is not very strong, right? So it makes a main stem up, and the side branch is a very narrow crotch and is very weak. And so it's constantly breaking off. Every year I have to go out and clean up some of these branches that are gone. And one of my big trees, I was just out there this afternoon cutting some off because it lost a whole side of the tree. So now I have half a tree. And one of the main branches on that is ready to go. So all I need is an ice storm or a strong wind, and it's probably going to come off too. It's a beautiful tree, but terrible wood. Are you going to grow something native, or do you care? So that's another thing to think about. A big decision is between deciduous and evergreen. I think both of these have their places. Deciduous tend to me more interesting, right? They change throughout the year. Many of the things that flower are deciduous, or at least that have nice big flowers, right? If you're trying to look for something with a lot of fragrance, pretty much deciduous. And it changes. So in the fall, we get nice colors. Evergreen kind of looks the same all year. Although when it grows in the spring, it actually changes color and can be quite nice. But it's there all year, but that's one of its strengths. So if you're trying to hide a shed, evergreens really work better because it's hidden all summer and winter. And then the last one is shape. And these things come in lots of different shapes. You can go out and kind of pick something that you like. The one in the bottom right there, I think, is an important shape to understand. That's a columnar type growth. So I have an apple tree that is probably 20 feet tall now, but it's only about 5 feet wide, if that. It's a beautiful tree. It's very, very narrow. So now you can get lots of these trees as a columnar form. An oak. I also have an oak that's very narrow. So if you have a small backyard, you can still have a big oak tree. Just get that shape. So We know which one we want. Now, how do we buy it? Well, there are a couple of options. This is the first option, and for larger trees, it's still a fairly common option. For smaller shrubs, you typically don't see this. We'll talk about potted ones in a second. This is called the B&B, or balled and burlapped. And so what the nurseries are doing right now is they're out in the fields. They've been growing these trees for the last 15 years, and they go out with these big machines and they dig up this ball. They surround it with burlap and wire, and then you buy it like this. The one thing you have to understand is that by the time a tree is this big, it's got a big root system, and the machine they have is basically cuts them all off. What you get here is about 10% of the roots it had in the field. Now, it's surprising they survive. They will survive if you treat them right. But obviously, this is not good for the tree, right? It just lost 90% of its root system. So one of the rules about these is they're okay to buy early spring, but don't buy these in midsummer and fall. Now, what I've noticed is that some of the nurseries are cheating now. They take these, not the really big trees like this necessarily, but sort of mid-sized trees, and they're actually planting them in pots. So when you go to the nursery, you think you're buying a potted plant, you actually end up with one of these. So it's worthwhile to dig down into those pots and have a look and see what you're getting. There's nothing wrong with these. You can move quite large trees like this, but you have to take a little more care with them. Now, when you plant these, no matter what the nursery says, all that burlap and wire and string come off. Okay? And a lot of nurseries will say, oh, you don't have to do that. Just pop it in the ground. The other way to buy these things are as potted plants. It's a little better to buy them this way if they've been growing in that pot. And the reason is that they have a complete root system. When you get a 10-foot tall tree in a tiny little pot, it's not a big root system, but at least it's a complete root system. Both work. The advantage of these is that you can buy them all season long. If you buy them in pots, the roots look something like this. So this is a root-bound condition. And I would do this with either perennials or trees or shrubs or anything that comes out of a pot. When you take the pot off, if it looks like this, you want to cut the roots. The easiest way to do this is to just make 4 vertical slices. What you're doing here is you're just slicing the outer ½ inch of roots. You want to cut a lot of those roots so that new side branches grow and it starts growing into the new soil. So how do you plant a tree? It's amazing. We've been planting trees for a very long period of time, and most people do not know how to do them. And probably the worst group of all are cities and municipalities. Okay, most of the trees they plant are not planted correctly. Nurseries do not know how to plant trees either. In fairness, they're generally hired by people. They want to do the job quickly and cheaply, so they cut corners. They may know how to do it, but they don't. So here's how you plant a tree. Before I look at that, you have to understand what a root flare is. So if we follow the trunk down on a tree, you'll reach a point where it starts flaring out. These are the roots. That's called the root flare. Now, this picture shows it quite high above ground. That's okay. That doesn't harm the tree. But we want to see the root flare at soil level or a little bit above soil level. We don't want to bury the root flare. So here's another picture of an old tree. It's been in here quite a while, and you can see the root flare. This is probably planted a little better than the last one. Okay, so you just start seeing that flare. The day before you plant it, you water it really well, because no matter how careful you are, we're going to do some damage to the roots of this tree, and we want the whole tree saturated with water. Now it's time to plant. One of the suggestions is always plant these things the same depth as in the nursery. That doesn't work because nurseries plant these things too deep. So you take soil away, you find the root flare, because when you're done, you want that root flare at the surface of the soil. Now we dig a hole. Doesn't have to be much bigger than the root ball. We definitely don't want it any deeper than the root ball. If we do that, the whole thing will settle and the plant will be too deep. take all the wire and burlap and string off, we put this in, and we put the same soil back that we took out. So we don't amend it. No fertilizer, no peat moss, no compost, no nothing. Same soil goes back in. The reason is that we want this tree to grow in the soil that we have. There's no point in trying to con this thing and giving it really good soil in this little hole. The other reason is that if you amend the soil too much, you actually create a wet area around it, and the peat moss in there will stay wetter than the soil around it, and you have root problems. You normally do not have to stake these things, but if you do stake them, we use one stake, and it is taken out after a year. But quite honestly, most of the time you don't need to stake these at all. And then you mulch a bit and keep the mulch away from the tree. So this is something we call the mulch volcano. And so what someone has done here is they've piled up that mulch around the tree. You don't want mulch touching the tree, and there's no point in piling it up like this. It should be at ground level, and you only need a couple inches. 3 inches of mulch is a lot. All right, so let's talk a little bit about pruning. So I actually have a complete pruning course if you're interested. If you go to my website, Garden Fundamentals, and there's a menu called School, and under there, there's a course that's run by Udemy, which is an online school for teaching things. There's a whole pruning course, because we're not going to be able to touch everything tonight. But I'm going to give you the highlights of a pruning course. I start off with the Pavlis rules for pruning. Number 1, most people want to prune to keep things smaller, but you have to understand that every time you make a cut, you actually cause the plant to grow more. So pruning makes things grow more. Simple rule is that if you cut off flower buds, you don't have flower. So there's all these rules about, well, if it flowers in the spring, you prune after flowering, and if it prunes later in the summer, you prune in the spring, and so on. And those rules are okay, but it all boils down to this fact that if you cut off flower buds, you don't have flowers. So if you go out and cut off the flower buds on your forsythia or your magnolia, it won't bloom this year. It'll bloom next year because those are new flower buds. All the rules about pruning are different for evergreens. Not every evergreen, but most evergreens, and so I just treat them as one group. Evergreens have to be pruned differently, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The next one is understand why you're pruning. I think most of the problem people have is they go out in the yard, they've got their pruners in their hands, and they're ready to cut something they know they should prune, but they don't know what they're doing because they don't know why they're doing something. If that's you, go back in the house and leave the shrub alone. Trees and shrubs do not need to be pruned because in nature nobody prunes them. So they will survive just fine without you. Once you understand what you're trying to accomplish, then pruning actually becomes pretty easy. And the third one there is just don't be afraid of it. In most cases, except maybe the evergreens, if you cut the wrong thing, the plant will grow back. You won't kill this plant. Let's talk a little bit about pruning. We talked about this thing where the plant is growing, it's making sugars, it's taking the sun in. It does that through the green leaves. Every time we cut off green leaves, the plant can't make food for itself. So when is the best time to prune? Well, the best time for the plant was several months ago, late winter. There's still snow on the ground. Nothing is sprouting yet. The buds aren't developing yet. There's no leaves around. That's a good time to prune. If you prune then, it also heals faster. Once the thing starts to grow, then it has leaves. And if we come along and cut those leaves off, we've just harmed the plant. It just put a lot of energy into growing leaves. It's just ready to start to get the benefits from that and make its own sugars, and we come and cut them off. Something like a lilac, for instance, which the rule is to always prune after it flowers. That rule is for you because you want to see the flower. From the plant's perspective, we should prune that before it flowers because we won't cut off any leaves out. But I understand people want to see flowers, so you have to make a decision. Do I prune for me because I want to see flowers, or do I prune for the shrub, which means pruning earlier? But whenever you cut off leaves, you are harming the plant. The simple rule is this: if they flower early in the year, we prune after they flower, right? We see the flowers first. So we wait until the forsythia has flowered and then we prune. We let the lilac flower and then we prune. And we want to prune pretty soon after it's finished flower. Within a week or two is best. If these things are going to bloom later in the summer or in the fall, then we prune late winter. I was out cleaning off last year's flower heads off my hydrangea. And these are the paniculata hydrangea. They make flower buds on new growth. So they haven't started making those flower buds. They won't do that until June. And then they'll flower in July and August. So I can prune them now and I won't cut away any flower. They don't have any yet. In cold climates, you prune late winter. In warm climates, you can prune midwinter or summer. If you see problems, so disease, broken branches, anything like that, prune it right away. It doesn't matter what time of year it is. So how do we prune? So I've got 3 branches here. This is like the Goldilocks story, right? The one on the left, the stem was left too long. And if we look at the branch on the left, you can clearly see the bud forming there, right? If we leave too much of a stem, then that can get infected and it just becomes a dead stick out there. It's not healthy for the tree. So that's left too long. The one on the right, we've cut too low. We haven't damaged the bud, but we've cut so close to the bud that that cut will dry out, and there's a very good chance it will dry out that bud. And the one in the middle here is the Goldilocks is just perfect. There's a little bit of stem there, but not too much. If we have bigger branches, then there's also a special way to do this. And this is called the 3-way cut. Very quickly, if you need to do this, the best thing to do is to Google it. And I do have a video to show you how to do this. Because in 2 years from now, when you need one of these big branches cut, you probably won't remember it. But anyways, it's a 3-way cut. So the key is that the first cut is this little one in the middle. And we cut from the bottom up. Then we do cut 2 and then we do cut 3. And the reason we do this is that if this is a larger branch and we just cut it, we do the 3rd cut and we do that first, that branch is so heavy it can actually break off halfway through the cutting process and strip the bark off the main tree. So we're going to harm the tree. If we do it this way, we actually take all the weight off the branch and get rid of it. And then we just have this little stub to cut off. And so we won't have that problem. The other thing that's really important with larger branches is the branch collar. So the exact position that you cut this is important. And you can see just to the left of the blue line there for the 3rd cut, there's a little knob there sticking out. And that's the branch collar. It probably won't make any sense to you if you've never looked at it. So just go out tomorrow and look at some trees and look at some bigger branches and you'll see it right away. There's this growth. And this is the part that's going to seal over the cut. So we don't want to cut into that branch collar. Anyways, if you're going to cut a big branch, watch a little video before you do it. So why do we prune? Well, there's lots of reasons. One is to solve problems. So here's a picture of a branch that broke off. If we leave this ragged, it has a bigger chance of infection and so on. So we want to cut this and make a nice clean cut so it can cover itself off. And by the way, woody branches do not heal themselves. I used that word once already. They grow around the cut. They compartmentalize the cut. They don't actually heal the way our skin heals. The other reason you might do this is a central leader. So a lot of trees will come up and then they actually make 2 branches. But we don't want 2 branches. We want a single branch. We want a single trunk on this tree. And we got to get rid of one. You have to pick which one you want to get rid of, cut it off, and then it helps to stick a bamboo in there or some kind of piece of wood and tie it on just to straighten it a little bit. That's not necessary, but it does help a little bit for aesthetics. 10 years from now, if you didn't do that, the tree would still look fine, but it does speed up that process of looking well. Grafted trees are important. You have to know if you have a grafted tree, and you have to know whether you're pruning above or below that graft. Grafted plant is really 2 plants joined together at the graft. The top part is usually a plant that has great fruit, has great flowers, has some characteristic that we want. And the bottom part, the only important characteristic is that it has a good root system. All our fruit trees are grafted. Crab apples are all grafted. Any weeping trees, they're all grafted. So it's important to know whether they're grafted. And if you cut this below the graft, you've gotten rid of the good part of the tree, which is above the graft. The one area that this comes up a lot is that people will plant fruit trees of any type, and then they don't put guards around them, and then the rabbits have come and chewed away the bark, and then they say, well, will this regrow? And the answer is, but it will be the root system that regrows, and that's not the tree that you want. You want that upper part. So if the rabbit has girdled this stem and you get new sucker growth from the ground coming up, that's not the tree you want, so you might as well dig it out and get rid of it. You might want to do rejuvenation. So a lot of our shrubs will grow and they get thicker and taller, and they get so congested that they stop flowering. In fact, you'll notice that as this happens, the leaves get smaller and smaller because there just isn't enough room to get enough light to grow big leaves. And so they need to be rejuvenated. This happens with all our shrubs, with rose shrubs, forsythias, lilacs, whatever. And there's a process to do that. You go in and basically thin this thing out. The rule of thumb is never take away more than 1/3 of the wood. And if you follow that rule, you'll probably be all right. But again, if you're going to rejuvenate one of these, it's worth watching a video or taking a course to see how you do it. A lot of shrubs, even smaller ones, they just get too congested. So on the left side, I've got way too many branches. It's not growing well. When I'm finished rejuvenating this thing, it'll look like the one on the right. More air is getting in there. The branches are growing properly. It's going to make proper leaves. It's going to flower better. And it's going to be a much healthier shrub. You don't have to do this every year, but it does help to come in and do this every 2 or 3 years. And then we also prune for show. We prune things a certain way so that they bloom better, or they bloom in parts where we want it. So I mentioned my hydrangea, for instance. And again, this is the paniculata kind. If you're wondering about hydrangeas, it can get very complicated. You have to know what type you have. The paniculata I like in this climate because it's very hardy. It blooms later in the year. Frost will not damage those buds because the buds grow on new wood. Right now, without pruning, they're 7 feet tall, 8 feet tall. And I could leave them. They don't need to be pruned. But then it will grow 2, 3 feet and bloom on top of that. So now they're blooming at 10 feet and I'm down here at 6 feet. So I don't like that. So I typically go out and cut these guys back to somewhere around 4 feet tall. Because I pruned them, they actually grow a little longer, so they'll grow up to about 6 feet, 7 feet, and that's where they bloom. And that's just perfect. That's just where I am. So I get the blooms where I want. A tree can be kept to any size, and that's very true. So you can grow a very, very big tree and just keep pruning it, but you usually end up with an ugly tree. Now, there are some of these pruning forms which are more popular in Europe. In North America, most people think this is butchery to a good tree. Key here is to plant the right size tree to start with, and you won't have that problem. Cloud pruning is another thing that's kind of interesting, and I have a video on that too if you're interested. So this is cloud pruning. You've got several clouds floating on this tree. And this is actually fairly easy to do, but you do have to pick the right kind of tree. I'm doing it with some pines, and I have a yew that I very heavily clipped. It was let's call it an 8-foot tall, big monster yew bush, and now looks a little bit more like the one in the picture here. All right, back to these branches. We've learned a little bit about how these things grow. Now, how do I prune this? Well, if I don't do anything, all of these branches will start to grow, and they will all try to take over. And just looking at this, I'm going to guess that the center one and the one to the right are going to win. And the reason is that the higher up the bud is above ground, the more nutrients it will get and the better it will grow. And those two branches are about at the same height. Now, the one on the right is a little thicker and it grew better last year. So I'm going to predict it probably grows better than that central one. If I want this to be a single stem, I have to get rid of the others, or I have to do something to make that center grow straighter. So in a case like this, what I actually do is this kind of a pruning. So I cut where the 3 blue marks are. And this is particularly true of a young tree. I don't want to take all those leaves off because it needs leaves to make food, right? But I also can't leave those branches because I want that central one to keep growing and be nice and straight. So I kind of take a halfway approach. I clip the tips off. So now the new growth points are lower than the central one, but it does have some buds, so it's going to make some leaves and make some food for the plant. Now, in 2 or 3 years from now, I may cut these off completely because I want more of a trunk shape on this tree. But for now, I leave the side branches because it will add more food to the plant and make it healthier. Another alternative is to make this cut. And if I decide that right branch is so healthy and growing so well, I'll just get rid of everything else and make it my new leader. And then I might put a stake in here and try to make it grow a little straighter. Or if this was in a shrub, so this isn't a single trunk tree anymore, this is now a shrub, I might cut it here to make it grow out from the center of the shrub. So whenever I'm cutting in a shrub, I'm always taking away the branches that are growing to the center of the shrub, and I leave the ones that are growing out from the shrub. That makes my shrub a little bigger, but it opens up the center and allows more air to get in, which means that the shrub will be healthier. Both of those work. That's why it's so important to know what you're trying to accomplish. Once you understand that and you understand how they grow, the cuts become pretty obvious. So we're almost done here. We want to go over some evergreens. So evergreens work a little differently. So here's a pine branch. We have the terminal bud, just like the other ones. And there are buds along this stem. They're dormant buds. A dormant bud is one that can grow, but probably won't grow. So as long as the terminal bud stays healthy, it will continue growing and this branch will get longer and longer. And the dormant buds won't do anything. If, say, an insect comes along and nibbles on that terminal bud and kills it, or maybe it's a pruner. A pruner comes along and cuts the tip off. Now there's no longer a terminal bud, right? The king bud has died. So now some of these dormant buds will start to grow and you get side branches. But in evergreens, these dormant buds don't live very long. In fact, the needles don't either. The needles on these trees live somewhere in the order of 3 to 6 years, depending on the species of tree, and then they naturally fall off. And some people get really concerned when they go out in spring and they see all these dead needles falling. Well, that's just normal, provided it's the needles towards the inside of the tree. These needles don't last forever. As the needles die off, so do the buds. At the back base here, these buds are all dead. They used to be dormant buds, but they're now dead and they will not grow. So if I cut this to the right of the needles, this branch will no longer grow. If this branch happens to be the central leader of this tree, I've cut out the leader and has no more leader. If I cut an evergreen low to the ground, there are no dormant buds living down there and the tree will die. Whereas if I do the same thing with a sugar maple, there's a very good chance that some dormant buds below the cut will regrow and they'll start to grow up again. In fact, we're seeing that a lot with the ash trees, right? The ash borer came through here. They've killed pretty much every ash tree. The upper part is dead. And what are they doing? They're all sprouting from below ground because the ash tree has lots of dormant buds down there. And so it will just regrow. Except now it's more like a shrub because about 10 buds all grow at the same time. And unless you go out and prune that, you're going to end up with a mess rather than a normal looking tree. So with evergreens, you have to know which evergreen you're pruning. If you're not sure, assume it's this way. So you cannot cut past the last needle. There are some exceptions. So the yew is one of them, for instance. A yew, you could cut that to the ground and it's going to resprout. It has live dormant buds everywhere, including underground. But your pines and your spruces and most other evergreens are more like this. You have to be very careful what you cut off.